Hello, scholars of religion. Miss Pingator coming to you on a Monday, just barely afternoon, April 6th. Getting started with our next unit, which we're going to combine Hinduism and Buddhism in the United States together so that we can make sure we're staying on track. So if you haven't already, go pull up this this presentation. I'm going to go through it, and I'm also going to post some notes for you. But feel free to make your own copy and take your own notes as we go through this. In this combo unit, so 9 and 10, Hinduism and Buddhism, first thing we have to do is make sure we remember how religions are embedded in culture. Religions change over time. Religions are internally diverse, and that all perspectives are situated. So if you haven't already, write those down right now. Go ahead, pause the video, write down those principles, because it's really important that as we go through this section, you start thinking about examples of those principles. So pause, write them down. So you should have your principles written down. How religions are embedded in culture, religions change over time, all perspectives are situated, and religions are internally diverse. In this unit, we're going to be focusing on the United States from the late 19th century to just past the mid-20th century, because this is when the United States and the quote-unquote West in general start to turn and look at places like Japan and India and Vietnam and China and really interact with different cultures and different people. We're going to talk about the cultural context, but we'll do that here in a moment. There's one of the foci that we're going to look at this unit is how immigrant religious practices of like Hinduisms and Buddhisms are different from how white Americans, so like non-immigrant people, non-Asian immigrant Americans, have taken pieces or parts of Hinduisms and Buddhisms and made them uniquely American. So we're going to kind of contrast and compare and look at the relationships between immigrant religious practices of Hinduism and Buddhism and non-immigrant practices of Hinduism and Buddhism. Finally, we're going to look at a couple contemporary examples of Hinduisms and Buddhisms in the United States, and a lot of your readings show examples of those contemporary practices. So that's kind of where we're headed. That's when and where we're talking, and the different lenses we're going to use to evaluate these kinds of religions in the United States. Okay, to begin, we're going to talk about our setting, our cultural context, which I said is the 1890s or so through about the 1970s, but some of your readings are a little more current than that. It's a pretty peaceful time in the sense that in the early part, we're post-Civil War, and we'll pop in times of peace after World War I and after World War II throughout this time period. There's a lot of prosperity for some. Where we have the Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age, the 14th Amendment is passed, women get the right to vote in this time. So for a lot of populations, there's this sense of American prosperity and American success, especially with increases in technology like electricity, science. We'll learn in a little bit here that Darwin's evolution of species theories kind of get applied in some funky ways and influence how people think about religion and civilization and evolution. And progress. So this kind of forward momentum that is kind of tinged with this American exceptionalism. We're finding success on all of these fronts, and in a lot of ways are a world leader when it comes to that kind of innovation. So those are some pieces of this time period that are really affecting the cultural context and allowing us to think about how the religions we're about to look at are embedded in this American culture of times of peace, prosperity, and progress. There's also, in this cultural context, a lot of government influence, both for and against immigration, that affects who immigrates and how they immigrate. To begin, we have the Immigration Act of 1924. Different acts of immigration came before it, including the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So this was kind of a big moment in a series of legislations that affected immigrants to the United States. The Immigration Act of 1924 is also known as the Johnson-Reed Act. It created a quota system for who could immigrate to the United States. And it used the population demographics of 1890 to determine how many and from where immigrants could come. And it worked like this. The quota system said that 2% of the total number of individuals from each nationality in the United States could immigrate, with a total cap at 150,000 every year. So we can talk about this as an example. If there are 100 German Jews in the United States in 1890, that means over the next year, 2 Jews from Germany can immigrate, because that meets the 2% quota of the German Jewish nationality. The immigration processes in the United States until this point already required literacy tests in that Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So I'd like for you to consider what preferences did these policies show? Because if you think about them and look a little bit deeper, you can think about which populations of people laws like this favor. Who is the government trying to let immigrate? And then who is being excluded? And you can think about specifically minority populations that we've talked about this up until this point, like Catholics and Jews. And you can also think about minority populations of people from India, Cambodia, Japan, China, Vietnam, all parts of Asia, and kind of look at how European immigration is being favored over Asian immigration, or Central and Eastern European immigration. Okay, I'm gonna put myself back. There we go. Next piece of legislation that changes or influences religious immigrants, Asian religious immigrants to the United States, is the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. So if we look at the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Immigration Act of 1924 as on one end of the spectrum restricting immigration, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 you could put at the other end of the spectrum. To begin with, this erased the quota system that the Immigration Act of 1924 put in place, and replaced the quotas with different metrics of immigration. So instead of the quota system, this Act of 1965 focused on 3 different kinds of immigration parameters. The first one is family reunification. So if you are an immigrant to the United States who had to leave their family to come here for opportunity and are like sending them money, this prioritized this kind of parameter for immigration, family reunification. It's sometimes pejoratively referred to as chain migration, but the it sits technically and legislatively family reunification. Next, immigrants who had needed skills for jobs and industry in the United States were also a little more welcomed and preferred. And then finally, we made a special consideration to refugees, people fleeing different kinds of like oppressive governments and religious persecution or famine. We gave refugees preference as well. So I'd like for you to consider at this point how, oops, well, let me go back. I lost my toolbar. Hold on. Okay, I'd like at this point for you to consider how this changes immigration in the United States from like how it's different from the Act in 1924. In terms of numbers, like how many more immigrants are coming because of 1965, and also who is immigrating now who wasn't before this act. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 increased immigration from regions like Africa, lots of parts of Asia, and South America. So we really start to see an increase of minority populations because this kind of opened the doors in a way that the 1924 Act had shut. Last piece of the cultural context that we're going to talk about is this gigantic moment in American and world history at the 1893 World's Fair, which was the first. So we had this World's Fair, and one of the events at the World's Fair that was held in Chicago in 1893 was the first World's Parliament of Religions. This still continues today, but the first ever World's Parliament of Religions was held in Chicago in 1893 at the World's Fair. And this event was created by two Protestants, one who was a minister and another who was a lawyer and a church member. Their names are Charles Carroll Bonney and John Henry Barrows. And this is a leaflet for an advertisement from the 1893 World's Fair, also known as the Columbian Exposition. So if you take a moment, you can pause the video and look at what's being communicated here. Notice who is on the top, kind of giving this grand like presentation gesture. And then notice all the different people represented here at the bottom, and this is kind of the shoreline here of Chicago. Okay, these are our two creators of the World's Parliament of Religions, John Henry Barrows and Charles Carroll Bonney. There were, like a lot of things we have talked about in the past few units of Religion in America, there are explicitly stated goals and implicit motivations. And we can kind of compare and contrast what is sort of publicly communicated as the goals and what kind of lies beneath the surface. So John Henry Barrows wrote a lot about his motivations for creating the World's Parliament of Religions. So you can read more about him, but this kind of gives an idea of what the public explicit goals were. So he says, for when the religious faiths of the world recognize each other as brothers, children of one Father, whom we all profess to love and serve, then, and not till then, will the nations of the earth yield to the spirit of concord and learn to war no more. If you're just taking that quote at face value, you can hear a lot of like a spirit of unity and a spirit of the world coming together in a shared understanding. But when you think about situated perspectives specifically, and you dig a little bit deeper into these words, you can recognize the kind of an air of American Protestant superiority or assumptions. So a couple things to keep in mind. Religious faiths. Faith is a very Protestant Christian word that many like members of other religions wouldn't use. Recognize each other as brothers, not siblings. We don't have a gender neutral term here, specifically brothers. Children of one father. So one male patriarch. Again, we're making a lot of Abrahamic monotheist assumptions about people's understandings, whom we all profess to love and serve. So if you look at it with a critical eye, you can start to kind of maybe question the like unity spirit. It's not there, but understand that these individuals' perspectives are incredibly situated, and their religious views are embedded in American Protestant culture. And it's not an excuse as much as it is an explanation to understand how and why they're publishing something like this. Okay, so explicitly we have this idea of religious unity. So yeah, talked about this, promote religious unity, demonstrate a shared understanding. So this is an image of the cover of one of the books that Barrows published about the meeting of the World's Parliament of Religions, which, if I haven't said yet, has representatives of religious people from all over the world. So on the title of his, or on the cover of his book, he has this biblical quote, "Have we not all one Father? Hath not one God created us?" Which, again, on its surface, you can really hear a spirit of unity. But you guys are critical scholars, and you know how to use different lenses to dig deep into words and recognize how they're situated and how they're embedded in culture. So I think the last slide, this quote from Barrows, and this cover are really good opportunities to practice using some of those lenses. Okay. There are some implicit motivations from these two gentlemen for convening this World's Parliament of Religions. We talked explicitly that there's this message of religious unity and a shared understanding, but implicitly, they're interested in demonstrating the religious progress, specifically religious evolution of the Protestants in the United States, and to also show the United States as a world leader of this evolutionary process of religions. So this was an evolutionary model of religions developed by these two gentlemen, creators of the World's Parliament of Religions, and many others during this time period. That civilization would kind of move through this ladder of religions from primitive or uncivilized forms to more proper, civilized, kind of actualized forms. And these were kind of the rungs of the ladder that these Protestant organizers thought the world would evolve, the order in which the world would revolve when we talk about religion. These implicit goals, these implicit motivations for demonstrating American Protestant superiority and demonstrating this evolution, the people who attended and were at the World's Parliament of Religions, particularly representatives from Asia, really picked up on that. We were not super subtle about it. So you can click on this link if you want to. It's underneath my toolbar now. If you want to take a look at more images from the 1893 World's Parliament of Religions. But by and large, Asian representatives felt this tension between the United States trying to demonstrate their Protestant superiority, but then also being kind of fetishly fascinated with the quote unquote exotic cultures of Asia. So here are a couple examples. The way the World's Parliament of Religions worked is it set up this massive, almost like zoo-like atmosphere where there were models, like life-size, created just for this event, models of different architecture and different religious people and religious rituals and religious buildings from all over the world. And when you went to the World's Parliament of Religions, you would get this map pamphlet that showed you how to walk from the Chinese village to the Japanese Shinto temple to like an Indian temple. And it included descriptions of what you would encounter as you walk through these paths. So this is an example of the quote that was included with this Chinese village. So if you think about yourself walking through this gigantic like model town that has all these different religious buildings from all over the world, as you're walking by, you're reading in the pamphlet descriptions. So when you would walk by this representation of a Chinese village, this is what the pamphlet had to say. A perfectly hideous noise made on a great brazen gong rendered the stay of a Caucasian terrible in these precincts and probably ruined the commercial prospects of the enterprise. Now would be a really great time to pause and write down what of our principles you notice in this moment. How is religion embedded in culture? How's it changing over time? How's it internally diverse? How are perspectives situated? Another example of a description that accompanied the map pamphlet at the World's Parliament of Religions, but this one for the Japanese Shinto temple. So that excerpt read, a company of odd, merry, and industrious Japanese artisans made their appearance in Chicago with innumerable packages and timbers. Their operations were, thereafter, daily contrasted with the progress of Americans on the great manufacturers' building nearby. It would be a good time for you to pause and think about what in this passage communicates the tensions that a lot of Asian representatives felt between American Protestant superiority and fascination with quote unquote Eastern culture. Another example of how Americans at the World's Parliament of Religions and after were fascinated and really like captivated by Asian culture is by one representative who is Swami Vivekananda. He's from India. He's a representative of Hinduism from India at the World's Parliament of Religions. And he took Americans, particularly American women, by storm. So the World's Parliament of Religion's website describes him as follows. A captivating Hindu monk, Swami Vivekananda addressed 5,000 assembled delegates, greeting them with the words, "Sisters and Brothers of America." His declaration introduced Hinduism to America. He's a very interesting individual to study because he was extremely charismatic and seemed to really adapt Hinduism to a fascinated and, in a lot of cases, drooling American audience. So he would be a really good example to think about when it comes to how like people in the United States were fascinated by what they found to be really exotic people and religions and practices.